Yeah.
That's how she is.
No, I think we need to do something about that.
I didn't even pay to go.
Come next June, you'll have your opportunity.
No, you won't. It says black.
You're on.
All right. Good morning. Good tov, Shabbat tov. Good morning, everybody. We are carrying on with the halachot of brachot, Tzurba Rabbanan, volume 14. As we have been discovering over the past few weeks, halachot brachot can be somewhat complicated. So we'll try and keep it as simple as we can. Hopefully, come out with a clear bottom line by the end of it. So we discussed last week Borei Pri ha'etz and Borei Pri ha'adama. Right, two of the, as we said before, we said at the beginning, maybe just to recap, we have one of six potential brachot, which we could say before food or drink. And the way we remember the order, again, is mimaga esh, that is the acronym Chazal gave us, meaning motzi is the first one in order of preference. And motzi, followed by mezonot, followed by Borei Pri ha'gafen, followed by Borei Pri ha'etz, Borei Pri ha'adama, and then she'akol. Not to say that a person would say every one of those brachot every time they eat. Obviously, it depends what food you have. If you were to say hamotzi, that would be poter, that would exempt the rest of the foods you would have. But it goes from the more specific brachot to the more general ones. Right? And as we explained, a more general bracha would at least be the efed cover food of a more specific nature. So if I wasn't sure and I was to say a she'akol, even on a fruit, that would exempt the fruit from the bracha. However, it's more preferable and it's correct to say the specific bracha for each fruit. So last week we discussed that when it comes to fruits, we have Borei Pri ha'etz, Borei Pri ha'adama. We discussed the different criteria, how we define a tree, how we know if something has, we saw machloket in that regard. How do we know if something has the bracha of Borei Pri ha'etz or Borei Pri ha'adama? We discussed a number of special cases, bananas, papayas, pineapples, etc. Not going to repeat that. I'll just mention again one point which we said, which was that again the more general bracha would at least b'diavad exempt a food even if it's more specific. So if I was to say Borei Pri ha'adama, even if the required bracha was Borei Pri ha'etz, since a tree ultimately comes from the ground, that is okay. If I was to say she'akol, which means everything, even if bracha required is Borei Pri ha'etz or Borei Pri ha'adama, that would be okay. If I accidentally said Borei Pri ha'etz, where I should have said Borei Pri ha'adama, or I should have said a food that only she'akol, that would not count. So today, let's talk about a slightly different topic. Page 185, we begin. So where we have, assuming that we know whether the fruit in question is Borei Pri ha'etz or Borei Pri ha'adama, again, referring to last week's share, but now that we know that, there are certain situations in which I'm eating the fruit, not in its original form, but it has changed its form somewhat. And then the question becomes, does it retain its original bracha, or now do I look at it differently and do I say she'akol? Talk about crushed produce, pureed produce. We'll talk about maybe fruit juices, soups if we get to that today or next week as well. So that is the discussion in question. Just one other point before we say that, by way of introduction, that when it comes to if you have a food which is certain fruits are normally going to be eaten cooked, and certain fruits are normally going to be eaten raw. Certain fruits cannot be eaten raw or cooked, for example. So, an apple is a good example of something which you can eat cooked and you can eat raw. So, therefore, the bracha is always going to see in a moment, so if it's crushed, etc. But they're generally speaking, it will retain its bracha. If there is a food which is generally only eaten in one way, so it's generally only eaten raw, and for whatever reason it's cooked, so then the bracha could change to she'akol, and vice versa. There was a fruit, quince, for example, which one would generally only eat cooked. If one was to eat it raw, well, then it would not be the original bracha. That would be she'akol. What happens if you take a food and you grind it up, or you mash it up, or you crush it up, so that now potentially it no longer looks like the original fruit that it was? Potentially the taste is different, or just its form is not the usual. So we have the sugya in the Gemara, page 185. We have the Gemara in Masechet Brachot, talks about some things. We aren't sure exactly what these concoctions are, but we'll see what comes out of it. So source number 24, Masechet Brachot, Daf Lamed Vav Amud Bet, says Amar Rava, Hai Hemalta, Ta'atya Mebei Hindoi Shalia, Umavachin Ale Borei Pri ha'adama. So the certain, this concoction called Hemalta, you see in the translation, so it's based on the way Rashi understands, some sort of ground ginger mixed with honey. Okay, it says that when one would eat that, one would say the bracha Borei Pri ha'adama. In other words, you have this the food, the original food, the ginger would be Borei Pri. Once it is ground and it's mixed up with honey, the point is the Gemara is teaching us that it still retains its original bracha. Source number 25, a little bit later on in the Gemara, says the following: Hilchata Tamri ve'avdinu tarima. So if one had dates and they made them into tarima, in a moment we'll see precisely what we mean by tarima. Says the Gemara, mevarchin elavei Borei Pri ha'etz. You would still say Borei Pri ha'etz. The original bracha on that fruit, even once it's undergone this process, which we have to define exactly what it is, it still retains its original bracha. It does not change to shakol. My tama. What is the reason? Why does it still retain its bracha? B'miltayu kaimi kedimei kama. Okay, that's significant line in the Gemara. It says because it retains its original state. We're going to see we now have a machloket going on for a number of centuries. What precisely does that mean? Retains its original state. To what extent does it retain its original state? Okay, so what is the Gemara talking about here? This tarima is some sort of crushed dates. That's what it seems to be. And we see how Rashi over here understands. In source number 26, Rashi says, Shem talima, kol davar katush ktsat ve'ino merusak. So he says, it's anything which has been crushed somewhat, right? Katush ktsat ve'ino merusak, but it is not pureed, it is not ground up completely. So how do you understand Rashi? Rashi seems to say that in this case in the Gemara where it says, the Gemara is teaching you that the original bracha remains, but really by inference, it's in order to teach us that there will be a situation where the original bracha will not remain. Here the bracha remains because it's crushed tzat, because it's crushed somewhat. But if the food is completely pureed, and it's then we would not consider it to retain its original form, and then we would say the bracha would change to shakul. So let's see how this works. Source number 27 over the page, Trumat Hadeshen. Rabbi Wein spoke yesterday in the Pirkei Avot about the Trumat Hadeshen, gave a little bit of the history of the Sefer. As we know, it's widely accepted that the questions, the book of responsa, where the questions and answers, in fact, the questions were made up. Trumat Hadeshen wrote his own questions in order to get to the answers that he wanted to teach. So the question which he asks over here, source number 27, is Latvelga, which is some sort of jam. Shosin migudgoniot shekolin. Okay, I'll leave the old Austrian for you to work out. Shemevashlin otam ad shehem nimochin legamli. So again, these are some forms of jam. The point is they're made from fruit, but they are cooked until they're crushed. They disintegrate completely. Marvin ba'en tavlin v'dvash. They're mixed up. Get with spices with honey. Yesh levalech alem shakol niyabedvar or borei pri. So what is the bracha? So again, the question is. Rashi said the case in the Gemara tells us it's the vakatush tzat, something which is crushed up somewhat. Here he's talking about something which is crushed up maybe completely. So let's see. Tshuva. So first thought he says one would still say Borei Pri ha'etz. Omnam idaikina beperush Rashi. Says the Trumat Hadeshen. Again, if we are exacting with Rashi's words, as we just explained, where the Gemara asks, what is the bracha you would recite on these tarima, on these crushed dates? But he says anything which is, said Rashi, which is crushed a little bit, that is the tarim. So now in bold, says the Trumat Hadeshen, mashma. Therefore, we can make the following inference. Rashi said if it's crushed a little bit, it would still say Borei Pri. But if it's crushed completely, then you would say Shakol Niyabed Varo. Mishum delav b'miltayu kaimi. It's no longer in its original state. That is the criteria.
But is the important part whether it's still identifiable as such, meaning an apple, a whole apple, raw apple is one thing. But people can still identify applesauce. I mean, they can still identify it. So is it a matter of identification?
Okay, so that's what it seems to be. We'll elaborate on that point shortly. But that's seemingly the understanding. Yeah. It says the other case we see in the Gemara. Yesh lama data mishum de'ochayo ba'achi lichtosh v'lishchok kol absamim. There with the ginger, he says there was completely ground. Well, that is an item. Like spices, where the general way of producing it, the way you would eat it is that you would crush it up completely. And And that is the ordinary way of producing this food. That's the ordinary way of eating it. So that's considered like it's in its original state. That is its state. Which is not the case with something else, which is not the common way for it to be pureed and processed, etc. Not processed, but for it to be pureed and pressed. He says, see, so this is not a new difficulty. It's already going back about 500 years. Says the Trumat Hadeshen, these distinctions, you can see there's going to be somewhat gray area, not completely clear. He says, Mikom Makom, lo yasu el safek b'davar. He says, even if all they do, there will be maybe a safek, upasku ravata, to korecha di'ikar sfeka b'bracha rishana, we have a cloud, a principle that wherever we have a doubt, an uncertainty regarding the bracha rishana, the best in that case would be to say shakol shama shakol niya bidvaro yatsa. Right? We can certainly, if we're not sure, and we say shakol niya bidvaro, that will be sufficient. So essentially, the Trumat Hadeshen, we're going to see that the Rama, and surprisingly, is going to follow along in his footsteps. Says we make a distinction to what degree. On the one hand, we make a distinction to what degree the food has been crushed, to what degree it's been pulverized. If it's only a little bit that retains its original form, then it retains the original bracha. If it's been crushed up completely and it now probably is identified as something different, then that's going to be shakol niyad bidvaro. If you have a case of a food where the ordinary way and the ordinary manner is to crush it up completely, so then he says it would still retain its original bracha. Now the Rambam of Yan Source 28 does not go into these distinctions. He understands, not like Rashi, or the Trumat Hadeshen, and it seems to understand simply the Gemara said the food retains its original bracha, it retains its original bracha. Says the Rambam in source number 28, the bottom of page 186, Tvash tmalim mevachin alav tchila shakol. Okay, so the honey that comes from dates, that the bracha would be shakol. Okay, we'll get to the liquids that come from foods a little bit later, because that's its own sugya. Aval tmarim shemeachan bayad ve'otzi galinin shelahem. So this is seemingly the stimra that the Gemara was talking about. He says if you take the dates and you crush them by hand, you take out the pips and you make them into this paste. There the bracha is Borei Pri. So again, he does not make any distinction in terms of how much it's crushed. It seems to be that even if it is crushed completely, unlike what the Trumat Hadeshen said, based on Rashi, the Rambam holds that it still retains the original bracha. We're going to see this machloket, and surprisingly, here we have between the Rambam and the Trumat Hadeshen in the days of the Rishonim, going through to the days of the Ashkenazim, and surprisingly, the Shulchan Aruch goes in there, follows the Rambam, and the Rama is going to follow the Ashkenazi custom, follows the Trumat Hadeshen. But fast forward a few hundred years to our times first, source number 29, you have the Plinei Halacha, this is Rabbi Eliezer Melamed from Haracha, and he writes in the footnotes in his volume on brachot to explain the svara, what is the disagreement here between these two Rishonim, and I think this relates to Mark's question earlier. He says, Nira לעניות דעתי, ששורש מחלוקתם הוא, שלדעת הרמב"ם, בכל מקרה, ריסוק אינו משנה את מהות הפרי, וברכתו נשארת כבל ראשונה. He says, according to the Rambam, however much you crush up the fruit, at the end of the day, it's still the fruit, right? And therefore you say the bracha. We can ask the question, why would the bracha change? You have dates, crushed dates are still dates, and therefore the bracha on dates is Borei Pri Adama. You have apples, and crushed apples are still apples, and therefore, Borei Pri Ha'etz, I should have said, right? Borei Pri Ha'etz. That is how the Rambam understands it, that the essence, the mahut of the fruit remains the same. It's still the same food. If we were to crush it and to start mixing things and start cooking it together, that is a different shayla, but that's not what we're talking about. Ulam, he says here in the fourth line, the Trumat Hadeshen u'de'imei, according to the other opinion, hakol taloi b'dat b'nei adam. We're relating to this not objectively but subjectively. How do we view this fruit? What do we look at? What do we call it? How do you identify, right? You don't, a date is a date. Once it's crushed up, it's called date paste or whatever it is. It's no longer a date, it's something else. And therefore, but if you have a fruit, here we go, you have a fruit which normally you would eat when it's crushed up, so you still relate to that as the fruit. ונשתנתה צורתו, מחשיבים אותו כפרי, and even after it's crushed up, it's changed its form, but you still relate to it as the same fruit. ברכתו כבראשונה, then the bracha will not change, כי לא על עיסוק קובע אלא דעתם של בני אדם. So that's how he understands this. According to the Rambam, it's what is this fruit objectively. According to the Trumat HaDeshen, it's I'm making the bracha. What am I holding in my hand? How do I relate? So we see the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah. Source number 13. Shulchan Aruch Orach Chaim Siman Reish Bet. Sif Zayin. Tmarim shemiachan beyad ve'asa mehem isad ve'hotzi mehem galiniyim afilu achi lo nishtanet bilkatom v'alech alehem borei pri ulevasov bracha mein shalosh. You can see the Shulchan Aruch more or less changes slightly, but more or less taking the language of the Rambam, as is the Shulchan Aruch's practice in many, many places. He says you have dates, they are crushed, they are mashed into this paste, they retain their bracha of Borei Pri. Says the Rama, Nahaga, Lefize, hu adin belatveon anikra pavidla, right, this jam which the Trumat HaDeshen spoke about, mevachin alehem Borei Pri. So this is the case which everybody agrees with, where it's been crushed somewhat. That's what Rashi says. Right, where it's crushed completely, he says there are those who say it should be shakol. So says the Rama over here, he says our practice and it's better is to say the bracha of shakol, either because we follow that opinion or because there's a safek and we should not get into the safek. He says nonetheless, okay, so he says in this case, actually, it would seem to be that the Rambam is correct, and therefore you could say, so, but if you said Borei Pri, you would have fulfilled your obligations. This is not like the case we discussed last week. Last week we discussed bananas, for example, where we saw there's a machloket rishonim as to what is the correct bracha to say on bananas. According to the Rosh, you would say Borei Pri. According to the Gonim, you would say Borei Pri Ha'adama, and our practice is Borei Pri Ha'adama. So you remember that we asked the question, what if a person accidentally said the bracha of Borei Pri Ha'etz on a banana? So there's actually a machloket regarding the machloket, but there was an opinion, there's a minority opinion that said that would be okay. But the prevalent psak seems to be that no, if you said Borei Pri Ha'etz, since we have established halacha, since the days of the Rishonim, that a banana is a Borei Pri Ha'adama, we don't consider it a safek anymore, and now and therefore that would not be sufficient. In this case, it's a little bit different, because what are we saying? We're saying we haven't established one way or the other. We're saying we know originally these dates should have been Borei Pri Ha'etz. Now they've been mashed up. Okay, there's a svara to say it's been mashed up, we relate to it as shakol. There's a svara to say it's still a date and therefore it's Borei Pri Ha'etz. So in this particular case, it's correct that it is a date, that it's Borei Pri Ha'etz. It's correct that it's a date. It's correct that shakol applies. So neither of those brachot would be factually incorrect, so to speak. Therefore, b'diavad, you would be, you'd say, with either one. But this says the Rama, it's better to, Shulchan Aruch says there's no question, Borei Pri Ha'etz. Says the Rama, better to say a shehakol. So again, how far does this go? See the Mishnah Berurah on page 188, source number 31. Just explaining the parameters. Again, according to the Shulchan Aruch, there's not. It's very straightforward. But according to the Rama, it's not clear. To what extent does the fruit have to be mashed before we say that we will change the bracha to shakol? So says the Mishnah Berurah in source number 31. Yesh omrim levarech alehem shakol. Bezen yechlaku ha'achronim. Now we have a machloket achronim. Yesh mehem shesovrim da yesh omrim lo pligi hi im avadilia mishum shenimuchut legamre v'lo nikal tzuratam klal. In other words, what is the machloket here between the Shulchan Aruch and the Rama? There are those who say that the machloket is only regarding this jam where it is crushed completely, and you do not recognize that the original fruit is no longer discernible. But if you can still recognize the original shape and the original form of the fruit, that they would say that the Rama even there agrees that it is Borei Pri Ha'etz. On the other hand, there are those authorities who understand this machloket to be more far-reaching. There are those who say the machloket is even it has been completely pure. So, and then he says, let's read the last paragraph and we'll just sum up. says מכל מקום להלכה, קיים עליהם כדעת המחבר, דרך שממשן קיים לא נשתנה ברכתן. We hold like the mechaber, in fact, like the Shulchan Aruch, that where the original, the essence of the fruit is still intact, then the bracha would remain. ורק בוודיליה, שעבד כל צורתו ולא נקל כלל מהו, only in this case, where it's lost its original form and you can't recognize the fruit anymore, אז לכתחילה מברך שהכל, וכהכרעת הרמה, וברכה זו יוצא לכל בדיעבד. Okay, so just to sum up, essentially what we are saying is this. If you have a fruit which is somewhat crushed up, it's partially been pureed, right, but not completely. According to everybody, the original, that was the Pshat Gemara, that was Rashi. According to everybody there, the original bracha would still remain. It would still be Borei Pri. Let's go to the other extreme. In a case where in a case where it has been completely crushed up. Okay, so here is where the fruit has been completely crushed up. Then, according to the Shulchan Aruch, we still retain the original bracha. What do we say according to the Rama? So if it has been completely crushed up, but you can still recognize the food, can tell that it's that original fruit, not because of what it says on the label, but because when you look at it, you can tell that this is it. So then the original bracha would remain. If it has been crushed up to the extent where you can no longer discern it, no longer recognize it, that is where the Rama says no. Over here we have to say shakol. Seemingly, according to the Shulchan Aruch, you still seem to say Borei Pri. So that is the
Fruit in the last case, we have to make shakol.
Today we're talking about bracha rishona. Today we're talking about. Let's not complicate.
But he won't be here for the next one.
You're gonna have to come back to find out. All right. So source number 32, just the summary. This is from Halachos of Brachas of Bodna, which is a contemporary sefer. He says fruits or vegetables which are mashed, chopped, ground, strained, pureed, or cooked to the extent that they no longer attain either their original form or appearance, are no longer subject to Borei Pri or Borei Pri Adama, and one would say shakol. For example, the bracha for strawberry or cherry jelly is shakol because the jelly has neither the physical form nor the appearance of the original fruit. For non-Americans amongst us, when he says jelly, I think he's referring to jam.
Yes. Yes.
Huh?
That's true.
You know, when I was growing up, again, you know, in South Africa, so jelly is jelly, what you call jello, and jam is jam. So they always used to talk about, you know, peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, which I could never understand how you put jelly into the sandwich. Until one day somebody told me that's actually that's jam. It made a lot more sense. Okay.
So if you see pieces of the strawberry in the jelly, the jam, and everything, you would still say shakol?
So according to the Shulchan Aruch, you wouldn't. If there's original. There's pieces of the fruit within it. So again, if you would say shakol, you would be Yosef, but it would seem to be that if the actual pieces.
Yeah, you would have pieces of the fruit. If you buy a cheap bread, you take a shot. You might say a shot.
Okay, so let's look at some interesting questions which come up on this, some applications beyond just the jam or the jelly or whatever you call mashed potatoes. I think according to everybody, it's called potatoes, right? Let's see, bottom of page 189. So this is an interesting discussion in the poskim. Actually, maybe have a look at the top of page 189. This is the Yalkut Yosef. This is based on the Psak of Rav Ovadia. Yeah, he says the din for Svardim. He says Tmarim shenit ma'chu legamre. As we've seen, if they are even crushed up completely, the bracha is still Borei Pri. That's the psak of the Shulchan Aruch. The en chiluk im miachan bayad or miachan b'muchana. Doesn't matter if they've been crushed by hand or by machine. Any other fruit or vegetable that has been crushed up similarly retains its original bracha. Right, which is mashed potatoes. Shetapoch adama murusak. Says the Mishnah Berurah, in source number 34 at the bottom of the page. He says that in this case, Ashkenazim are not going to disagree. He says, "Pirush af shenitlasek al yedei zeh legamre afilu mevarchim borei pri etz mishum dekevan de'adayin mamashan kayam shayach levarech alein borei pri etz." There, I think he's still talking about the jam or about the fruits, but he says again. Even if it's been completely mashed up, but it still retains its essence that is intact, so that would still be Borei Pri, and therefore, huadin le'inyan Pli ha'adama. This is not just true by fruits. We would say Borei Pri ha'etz. Also, we would say Borei Pri ha'adama. Kagon ald apple. Very interesting. I'm assuming this is in Yiddish. In many languages, potato has the same thing, right? Which is apples of the ground. Tapuach adama. That's what we call them in Hebrew. This is in Afrikaans as well. There's about 3 words that I remember in Afrikaans from growing up in South Africa. But an aardappel is a ground apple, which is a potato. So that's seemingly the same. It's the same word here. But that's what he's talking about. Potatoes. Shemiachan ve'asaan ki'isan. In other words, they were mashed potatoes. You look at them, you say, what is it? What does it look like? What can I see? It's potatoes. It's mashed up, but it's still potatoes, and therefore it's still Borei Pri ha'adama. Okay, what might be different is where you have a mashed potato which has never seen a potato in its life, where it comes from powder, right? That is, it says the Piskei Teshuvot, that over there where it's completely ground up and it's turned into flakes, turned into powder, which are not recognizable as potatoes, and then you add water, and then you cook it as puree. There he says that would be shakol. See over the page, source number 35. Right, it says Gam ki aderech nafotz meod lechol tapukei adama b'tzura kazot puree v'af im ma'arvivim ba shemen u'ma'at tavlinim leitlan ba. Even though you've mixed some oil, you've mixed some spices, nonetheless, that's still Borei Pri ha'adama.
Make latkes.
Yeah. Latkes enachinami. Latkes would be the same. There it's fried, there it's cooked. Again, it's the usual way of eating the food. It's still recognizable as a potato, and that would be the same bracha. But here he says, therefore, lo nishtanet birkata. The bracha does not change, but the bit which is in brackets is aval ima bavim beitzim chadomem nishtanet birkata l'shakol. Again, if you've mixed in eggs or something, and the majority is not potatoes, or he says chen pile anasem me'avkat tapukei adama, which is made from flakes, which are grounded up, that then the bracha is going to be shakol. We'll see if this comes up when it comes to cereals and corn flour, etc. That is a relevant discussion also. Yes.
I want to go back to the fruit.
Okay.
Dates.
Yes.
Stays at the same form,
Yes.
but you took out a tagalim and you put in nuts and you covered it with chocolate. And it has, I do it, so I
Making me hungry now.
Yeah.
it's good. So it has the same form, but you can't say Borei Pri ha'etz on it because it has a chocolate around it and the nuts.
Okay, so now you're asking a different question. What let's just understand. We're dealing with where you have one item, you have one fruit, and it's changed its shape, it's been crushed, whatever. You're asking a question: what if it's now coated in chocolate, or sometimes you get the nuts that are coated in flour, or whatever it is. So you have 2 different foods which are mixed together in whatever way. And then the question is, which bracha do I say? Do I say bracha on food A, or do I say the bracha on food B? So there we get into a sugya of ikar v'tafel. What is considered the main ingredient? What is considered the secondary ingredient? Sometimes we say bracha on one, sometimes the other, sometimes on both. Okay, we'll get to that, but one step at a time. I said at the beginning of the share, Hilchot Brachot are extremely complicated as we are learning. So one topic at a time, but we will get there. Ikar v'tafel, I think, already in this volume. The next share, meaning it may not be next week, probably won't be next week, but we'll get there eventually, is about ikar v'tafel. Right, primary and secondary foods. There's plenty to talk about. I think that the case of nuts might even be a picture in here. Just flicking through. Saw it somewhere, but it's gone. Okay, but it's in here somewhere. We'll get there. But talking about the next case, which is brought here on page 190, is regarding falafel. So falafel, as you know, come from chickpeas. Again, when you look at a falafel ball, you ask somebody, what is it? It's not, they don't say chickpeas, they say it's falafel, right? It's something else which is, meaning it's somewhat recognizable. So there are those, you can see in the box over here, there are those such as Rafos, who's also wrote the Laws of Brachot, which is another contemporary sefer. He writes that one should say ha'adama on falafel balls which are eaten by themselves, because obviously if you're eating it within pita or lafa, then you would say the hamotz. But he says that it's adama because the original chickpeas are somewhat recognizable. However, I think that the more commonly accepted practice would be to say shakol. And you can see Pninei Halacha again, source number 36. He explains in this way. He says, when it comes to falafel balls, the bracha would be shakol. Even though it comes from chickpeas, and it's not crushed completely, כיוון שהמערבים בו מרכיבים נוספים, ולא ניכר על מלאהו וטעמו שהוא חומוס, ברכתו שהכל, since it has additional ingredients, since again it is not completely discernible when you look at it and when you taste it, that it is chickpeas, right? If you eat chickpeas by themselves or eat falafel, it's completely different. And therefore, according to many, the bracha would be shakol. What about hummus? Right, again, oftentimes you don't say a bracha on the hummus by itself because you're eating it together with bread or pizza, whatever it is. But the hummus, which comes from the chickpeas themselves, which is crushed up, it still looks like the chickpeas, and it sometimes they even have chickpeas inside. What would the bracha there be? So he says, yeah, when it comes to so also with the falafel, it says the bracha is shakol, but like we saw previously, that if one did say hadama, yatsa. He says, "Achel salat hummus, af shenitcham legamrei, kevan shakol yodim shul hummus mevarech hadama." So he says that interestingly that hummus salad, since it looks like chickpeas and everybody knows where it comes from, that the bracha would be hadama. I saw that Rav Dov Lior holds the same psak. He says hadama. There are other poskim who say that on hummus paste by itself you would say shakol because it's again you can see, as the Trumat HaDeshen said, these chilukim, these distinctions are not completely clear. Do we say it is recognizable? It's not recognizable. There are those who say, again, I don't know, can't vouch for this, but there are those who say that the manufactured hummus has got the amount of actual hummus that it's got in it is so small, and it's all other sorts of things which they put inside. I don't know. I can't vouch for that, but I did see somebody who said such a svara, and therefore would say shakol. But that is the argument you have there. So again, in terms of the falafel balls, the more prevalent opinion seems to be to say shakol. With the actual hummus itself, there are also those who say shakol, those who say Borei Pri. But at the end of the day, if one is not certain, so we say shakol, and we've certainly fulfilled the obligation of the bracha. Similar discussion we have just before we get to the soups. Well, two more really. We have a discussion regarding corn flour or things which come from corn. So you have lots of cereals. Cereals gets very, very complicated. I'm sure you've all seen the charts that are out there on the internet. You have the brachos charts of all the different cereals and what the bracha rishona is, what the bracha achrona is. Sometimes you even have the same cereal, but it's made in the same cereal with the same company, but it's made in different countries and they have different ways of making it. So Kellogg's cornflakes might be in one country, it might be shakol somewhere else. Where does that come from? So you can see here the halacha brura, source number 37. He writes, so you have crushed or puffed toasted corn, cornflakes, corn snacks, the like. He says, if they have been puffed up or mashed completely to the extent that you cannot recognize the corn at all, and also the taste has changed. As we've seen, it's been crushed up completely, and the original, corn is no longer discernible. The bracha would be shakol. As we saw, similarly to by the potatoes, if the corn was crushed up completely and was changed into flour, now it's no longer recognizable as corn, and therefore it's shakol, and it's made from that, then that would be shakol. He says, Yesh la'il. It changes from one place to another. Sometimes large amounts of grain of flour are going to be added, and then if that is going to constitute the majority, your bracha will be mezonah. And therefore one should check before the different brands of cereals in terms of what it is, what the bracha is. And again, as I said, if one is not sure, this is where the halacha comes in, that one does not know. Certainly, if one said shakol, one would be yotzei in that way. Okay, source number 38 goes into a little bit more detail regarding cornflakes. What about one more example, very common example of fruits which are mashed up, which is we get to avocados and eggplant or aubergine, whatever you call it, chatzilim, in the vernacular. So source number 39, here is the Pnei Halacha. So he says again, al avocado shenimach, we have mashed avocado, He says maybe it's not completely mashed. I'll say even if it is completely mashed, nonetheless, it's still avocado is very recognizable. The taste, the texture, the appearance, it's green. You can see that it's exactly the color. You can see that it is avocado, and it's very recognizable. And therefore, that would retain its bracha of Borei Pri. Even if you've added a bit of onion, a bit of lemon, whatever it is, it does not change. And therefore, everybody relates to it as avocado or guacamole or whatever you call it. That is going to retain the same bracha of ha'etz. He says a similar thing regarding chatzilim, regarding eggplant. He says salat chatzilim asoim chatzilim meuchim im mayonnaise. There also it retains its texture. It's not mashed completely. And and therefore one would say hadama. I think we discussed last week regarding eggplant, whether it's ha'etz or hadama, the reasons for that. And then he says finally, what about if you have puree? Right, this is sometimes something which baby fruits, etc., where you have fruits but that are completely crushed and pureed. There the bracha would be shakol because that's completely been pureed, it's undergone a change. But if you still have bits, large pieces of fruits inside, then you could say Borei Pri, and that would exempt the entire mixture in that way. Okay, so that is it in terms of the different mashed and pureed fruits, etc. Again, the general rule of thumb is that so long as it's still recognizable, the original fruit that it was, that would retain its bracha. Where it has been pureed completely and it's no longer recognizable, not by name, not by appearance, and not by taste. Again, it's with the exception of the label on the box or the can or whatever it is, but then it would be a shakol, and certainly in cases of doubt, the bracha of shakol would always be sufficient. Let's move on. We'll begin, I think, today, and then we'll conclude it next week. But relating to the bracha on soup, many different types of soups and vegetable soups, and here it gets very, very complicated. Sometimes you might just have a vegetable soup. You have the broth, which has got the taste of the vegetables, but it is completely liquid. Sometimes you may have large pieces of vegetable in the soup, and sometimes there's a question, right? Are you eating the soup for the vegetables for the soup, right? What is taking priority here? It's going to relate as well to the question of the karva tafel, which was mentioned. You might have, what if you add other things, croutons or canedels or noodles into the soup? And then the question is mizonot. Maybe we have to say 3 brachot, right? What is the bracha on soup? So, page 207. Again, oftentimes this doesn't come up because you have soup, certainly on a Friday night, you've had your challah, you've had your lechem mishnah, you said hamotzi lechem min haaretz, and that is going to exempt. You don't have to say any more brachot, so we don't think about it. But assuming, and oftentimes I think it's quite common, people eat bread with their soup and therefore say the bracha on the bread, no question, that exempts the soup, all the components, the vegetables, the kaned, everything. But if you did not eat bread with your soup, right, what bracha rishona would you say? So the first thing is we seem to have a contradiction before we get to the Rishonim, but we have a contradiction in the Gemara itself in terms of what the bracha would be when we take fruit or vegetables and we cook them in water, which is essentially what we're dealing with. Which bracha would you say? So source number 1, we're on page 207 now. Again, we're not going strictly according to the order of the Shirim here, that's why the number resets to number 1. But source number 1, Masechet Brachot Daf Lamed Tet Amud Aleph. Amar Rav Papa, Pshitali. Whenever it starts off and it says Pshitali, it's obvious. We know we're in trouble, right? It's obvious, but it's not going to be so obvious. But says Rav Papa, it's obvious that Maya da silka ka silka, umaya da lifta ka lifta, umaya da kulushalke ka kulushalti. He says different types of vegetables. Silka is beets, right? The beet water, you took these beets and you boiled them in water. And the understanding here is that now the original fruit or vegetable has been removed. All I'm left with is the water in which the vegetable was cooked. So he says that the water in which beets were cooked is the same as beets. It has the same bracha. The bracha that you were to eat this water, what we would call soup, you would say the bracha of Borei Pri Adama. Same thing if it was turnips, right? You boil turnips in water, my delifta kelifta. And then he says, not just that, but any cooked vegetable, ma'ida kulu shalki, any boiled vegetables, they're boiled in water, the kulu shalki. They have the same status as that, vegetable. Okay, so if we just to stop here, right, Lamed Tet Amud Aleph, very simple, vegetable soup, the bracha is the same as the vegetables, and that's it, we can end the share now. However, I tricked you all because there is a Gemara on the previous page which says something slightly different. Source number 2 is Masechet Brachot Lamed Chet Amud Aleph. Amar Mar Bar Avashi, Hayduv Shadatamli Mevarchin Elavei She'akol Niya Bidvaro. We mentioned this before. We saw in the Rambam, but here he says the date honey, the honey that comes that is extracted from the dates. The bracha is She'akol. But wait a minute, it just came from dates. It came from the fruit itself. Why She'akol? Ma'itama Zeya Be'almahu. That is an expression we find in a number of places, and it comes up with Nilchot Brachot, comes up in a number of other contexts as well. But it says that this is not the essence of the fruit. This is merely moisture that is dripping off from the fruit. So now the question is as follows. It doesn't seem to make sense. If you look at these two sugyas together, and again, they're not very far away in the Gemara. One is one daf after the other. If on the one hand we say that the moisture which comes, we'll ask another question, which we won't get to today, but hopefully we'll get to next week, which is what about fruit juice? Right? If you are to extract the juice from apple juice or orange juice, etc., what would be the bracha? According to this Gemara, that says that the honey that comes from the dates, we call it zeya ba'alma. It's just it's merely moisture that drips off from it. So then we would think that's She'akol. So the juice would seemingly be She'akol as well. We'll get to the juices next week. But if you're saying that the moisture, the juice from the date itself is She'akol, so I would say kal v'chomer that the water in which is not from the vegetable itself, but it's the water in which it was cooked, that should also be She'akol. And that is why it's a chiddush that Rav Papa comes along and tells us, actually, no, there it is not She'akol, there it is going to be Borei Pri Adama. So why the water that comes from the fruit itself, we say She'akol, but the water just in which it was cooked, which is external towards it, that has the bracha of Borei Pri Adama. Surely it should be the other way around, or it should be consistent. So that is the difficulty, that is the contradiction we have in the Gemara, and we have two main approaches in the Rishonim to resolve this difficulty. Approach number 1 is the Rashba. Rashba, really, source number 3, he says the following. He says, why are they, again, everyone is trying to understand why are these two cases not going to be similar. So says the Rashba number 3, Lo damya lamaya deshalke. I hear this the case of the date honey. That is not where I say She'akol. That is not similar to the case of the cooked vegetable water. Umaya deshivta dehanu kevan de lov achilatan hu al yedei shlika me shlikatan kmotan. So says the Rashba, what is the criteria over here? The criteria is what it is, what's most common, what's it used for. He says, since these vegetables that Rav Papa was talking about, the way that they are eaten, the most common way of their consumption is by cooking them through boiling. Therefore, the boiling water is considered like that. And therefore, he says any fruit or vegetable which is not generally eaten by being boiled or being cooked, or by having its juice squeezed or extracted. But if the way to eat it is just eating that food raw, and you were then to go and cook it, it says, then we would not say that the liquids would be like it. Again, if we go back to the Gemara just for a moment, and you see the way the Rashba learns this, in source number 1, he says, Maya Kulu Shalki, says the water of all these boiled vegetables. You would understand vegetables which you normally boil, that's the way that you eat them. But if there's a vegetable that you don't boil, for whatever reason, a person has decided there's a newfound diet, whatever it is, I'm going to boil all my vegetables, things which people have never heard of. Okay, then you would say you would eat that water and you would say She'akol. But if it's the usual way of doing it, that is why you would be that is why it would retain their bracha as of being boiled. We can ask the question the other way. What about the case of juices, etc.? If that's the regular way of squeezing this fruit and therefore extracting the juice, would then the bracha change to Borei Pri and not She'akol? That would be the other side of what the Rashba was talking about. But right now we're focusing on this part, on the soup. And again, our question was, why does the Gemara say? Because the Gemara says that the water which comes from the fruits is zeya ba'alma and it's She'akol. Why does Rav Papa tell me that if I boil the vegetables in water, the bracha on that water, which has the taste of the vegetables, is Borei Pri Hadama? It's because that's the normal way of cooking it. And that's the normal way of cooking it. I consider that water to be part of the vegetable itself. That is the Rashba. The Rosh says it's got nothing to do with how the food is normally used or not, but it's got something to do with the process of cooking here and what it does. So says the Rosh as follows, number 4. He says, Maya de silka, Maya de lifta, Maya de shita, Borei Pri hadama. All these, as the Gemara told us, we say Borei Pri hadama. Dekai malan, Maya de kulu shalke kishalkim, v'chin alem Borei Pri hadama. Af api she'en bo kiyama malak. Even though here we're just dealing with the soup, with the flavor of the vegetables. In other words, we don't have the actual pieces of vegetables, like we said. See, when it comes to soup, if we have the actual large pieces of vegetables inside, that may make a difference. But here it's just a liquid. Nonetheless, he says here in bold, this is not like the case of fruit juice or the liquid which is extracted from the fruits themselves. Says the Rosh that the method of cooking, when you boil it in boiling water, that has a very strong way of imparting the taste of that vegetable into the water. He understands more than it's just a where the juice just drips, or the honey just drips off from the dates. That does not taste like the date. That is ba'alma, that is something external. But here, when you cook it together, the cooking really imparts the flavor of the fruit or the vegetable into the water, and that is why you would say Borei Pri hadama. So, according to the Rashba, the reason why you say the bracha again, according to everybody, Rav Papa said in the Gemara that you have this vegetable soup, right? We'll call it that for lack of a better word, the vegetable soup. You would say Borei Pri hadama. According to the Rashba, because that's the way that it's normally eaten. That's the way that it's cooked. According to the Rosh, I don't care if that's the way that it's cooked or not, but that imparts a stronger flavor, and therefore that's why it's going to be. How does the Shulchan Aruch pasken? So the Shulchan Aruch also seems to contradict himself, and this is going to be a difficulty to understand. Source number 5, the Shulchan Aruch says, "Alamayim shebishlu b'ayim yelakot mevarech habracha atzma shevarech al yelakot atzman." So first of all, he just says that's Rav Papa from the Gemara, that you have water in which you cooked. Again, I just have to say the nafkamina between the Rosh and the Rashba would be if I have a vegetable which is not normally cooked, not normally boiled in water, and I do boil it in water. So according to the Rashba, that's not the way it's normally eaten. The bracha would still be shakol. According to the Rosh, it's been boiled, and therefore it's imparted the taste, and the bracha would be Borei Pri hadama. Yeah, the Shulchan Aruch says he doesn't distinguish between whether this is the usual way of cooking or this is not the usual way of cooking. He just says Mayim shebishlu b'ayim yarakot, where I have water in which I cook vegetables. The bracha that I say is the same bracha I would have said on the vegetables. Afal pi she'en b'ayim ela tamayim. So again, that is more or less quoting the language of the Rosh. It makes no distinction what type of vegetable it is or not, and therefore that is how it seems from source number 5. However, source number 6, which again is a little bit earlier in the Shulchan Aruch, he says perot sheshla'an or bishlu or bishlan b'mayim. You have fruit which has been soaked or cooked in water. Okay, so interesting. What do you see here? That soaked implies maybe not just the cooking, maybe not just cooking through heat, and that might mean we'll see what that means. Even though the taste of the food is going to go into the water, the bracha would still be shakol. Okay, so there you see that he quotes the Rosh as a second opinion. If he's quoting the Rosh as a second opinion, it would seem that his first opinion is not like the Rosh, but rather is like the Rashba. So how do we resolve the contradiction in the Shulchan Aruch? So the Taz over here in source number 7 understands the following. He says that the cases that the Shulchan Aruch is talking about, source number 5 and source number 6, are different types of foods. He says, you'll notice as well, by the way, that in source number 5, the Shulchan Aruch mentioned here yirakot, which is vegetables. In source number 6, he talks about perot, talks about fruits. It's going to be more common for the yirakot to be cooked in water than it is for the perot. So says the Taz, but that's what we see here at the top of page 209, source number 6. Says the Taz in source number 7. Then it ba'er the yesh machloket ben Rashba le'Rosh u'mashma pasak ha'Shulchan Aruch sham the yesh safek v'velech shakol. Right? It seems from source number 6 where the Shulchan Aruch brings both opinions and he seems to say that the bracha would be shehakol. Tzarich lomar, even though in source number 5 he said you say the bracha of the vegetables. So tzarich lomar the kan maili midavar shedarko levasher or lischot dibazeh modeh al hashba shemalech kamin hapli. In other words, says the Taz, I understand the Shulchan Aruch paskins like the Rashba, that what is the determining factor is whether this is the normal way that this is cooked or not. And therefore, in source number 5, where the Shulchan Aruch says you cook yirakot, you cook vegetables, he's implying vegetables which are normally cooked in water, you cook them in water, then their bracha would be, the bracha of their water would be Borei Pri Adama, just like the vegetables. In source number 6, where he's talking about perot, seemingly he's talking about perot, which is not the usual way to cook them in water. And he says, nonetheless, if you did, so he says, you don't say the bracha, you say shakol. And you should know that there is also an opinion of the Rosh who says that even in this case, you would say Borei Pri Adama. Okay, whether right. Over here he's talking about perot. Good. I'm glad you're listening. So source number 8 is the Mishnah Berurah. It says לעניין הלכה, פסקו האחרונים לכתחילה לברך שהכל ובדיעבד נברך בורei pri ha'etz yatsa. So we say shakol. So seemingly, based on that, it would seem that if I have a soup, vegetable soup, right, which has just got the water, does not have any pieces of vegetables in it, then it would seem to be at this point that shakol, and certainly b'diavad, shakol would be okay. That seems to be the pshat of the Shulchan Aruch, based on the Taz and based on the Mishnah Berurah. However, it's not so simple, because what happens when we have vegetable pieces in the soup? What happens when we have other things in the soup? What if the soup is based on powder, etc.? So that is, I think we'll end it there for today, and we'll pick up there next week. We'll do a brief recap of what we've seen. And there's a lot of material here in terms of the machloket in the Gemara, machloket in the Rishonim, getting out into the Achronim. I don't want to try and rush through the bottom line, but I'm going to leave that for next week. Yeah. Get a piece of bread, make a multi. That's the easiest thing. Okay.
Thank you.
Just have bread. Have bread with it.
That's the easy.